Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk about FAQ on professional practice, letter of release. All FAQ information shared in this talk is directly sourced from the official Board of Engineers Malaysia, BEM, website. Disclaimer: this talk merely reads out the FAQ content. No responsibility is assumed by the producer for its accuracy, interpretation, or application. An engineer who is responsible for submission of drawings to the local authority resigns or retires halfway through a project. Another engineer within the same engineering consultancy practice, ECP, takes over. How does the BEM view this issue in the context of engineer taking over the works of another? If it can be established that the second engineer is from the same engineering consultancy practice as the first engineer, then the issue of supplanting does not arise. If a project has changed hands, i.e. previous owner has sold to another company, is letter of release still required? The letter of release is still applicable where the new project has linkage to the previous project, whether in terms of ownership or development details. You can refer to BEM Circular Number 008 Procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice. If in doubt, it is advisable to refer to the BEM for clarification. In a design and build contract, the first engineer is engaged by contractor to design and supervise. However, after the contract is awarded to the contractor decides to engage a second engineer to carry out supervisory work, with no change made to the design works by the first engineer. Does the second engineer need a LOR for supervision work? BEM Circular Number 004 Supervision of Construction Works clearly stipulates that the submitting engineer must design and supervise the project to completion. If the first engineer did not supervise the construction, then he should not sign the CCC or equivalent. If the second engineer wishes to take up the supervision work, then he must obtain a LOR from the first engineer and also take over as the submitting person regardless of whether the original design is changed or not. In the event that the PEPC voluntarily discharges/releases himself during the project, i.e. not completed, and there is no second engineer to take over, will the local authority accept it as there will be no engineer responsible for the project? A PEP cannot simply relinquish his services unilaterally without the consent of the local authority. The PEPC must notify the local authority first. If there is no qualified person, submitting person, supervising construction, site work cannot proceed. Note that improper termination of duties by the PEPC will affect public interest, and also subject him to legal recourse by the client on losses suffered amongst others. A project or piece of property changes ownership and the new owner appoints his consulting engineer. If the previous owner has not settled the fees to his engineer, first engineer, and no physical work has commenced on site, has the newly appointed engineer, second engineer, erred in accepting the appointment as he may not be aware of the previous appointment by the previous owner. It is the duty of the second engineer to verify that there is no previous first engineer on board. In the event that the second engineer was initially not aware of a previous appointment by the previous owner, but subsequently finds out that there was, then it is his duty to immediately inform his client and seek a LOR from the first engineer. Note that a letter of release is applicable where the new project has linkage to the previous project, whether in terms of ownership or development details. You can refer to BEM Circular Number 008 Procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice. If in doubt, it is advisable to refer to the BEM for clarification. When a project is partially completed and the owner terminates the first engineer's services and appoints a second engineer to take over, will the second engineer be liable for the portion of works already partially completed under the first engineer? The last man standing rule applies. Whoever is the submitting person signing off the completion works will assume full liability even if some of the works had been carried out earlier before his involvement. How does an engineer respond when the client's draft memorandum of agreement with the engineer contains a clause which stipulates that the engineer shall give a pre-signed letter of release or to forward a letter of release immediately upon receiving a termination letter from the client? The engineer should inform the client that the law overrides all contractual provisions and he must follow BEM Circular Number 008 procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice. Otherwise, he will be contravening the law. He should then insist for such a clause to be deleted from his agreement. I am the first engineer working on Project A as the ECP, Engineering Consultancy Practice, engaged to carry out engineering consultancy for CNS works. If the client owes me fees, and I take adjudication proceedings under the Construction Industry Payment and Adjudication Act 2012, (CIPA), to recover my fees, do I lose my position as first engineer and the client can engage another engineer, second engineer, to take over my work without letter of release? If an ECP, first engineer, serves a notice or adjudication defined in Section 5 of CIPA to recover his fees before being terminated by the client, the ECP has not lost his first engineer status. The second engineer cannot take over from the first engineer unless he obtained the letter of release from the first engineer or he can follow the procedures stated in BEM Circular Number 008 procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice. However, if the first engineer after being terminated, proceeds with any of the actions listed below after termination, then a letter of release is not required and the second engineer can take over the project. For an action in court, when an originating process defined in Order 5 of Rules of Court 2012, ROC, is filed. For arbitration, when a notice of arbitration defined in Section 23 of Arbitration Act 2005, AA, is served. For adjudication, when a notice of adjudication defined in Section 5 of Construction Industry Payment and Adjudication Act 2012, (CIPA), is served. I am the first engineer working on a Project A as the ECP. The client terminated my service and filed a lawsuit against me related to Project A. Can the client engage another ECP, second engineer, to just take over my work without the letter of release from me? If the client has terminated the first engineer and/or filed a lawsuit against the first engineer, it does not mean that second engineer can take over the work of the first engineer without letter of release from the first engineer. The 2ND engineer before taking over any project has to ensure that he does not violate Regulation 31 of the Registration of Engineers Regulations 1990, revised 2015. The second engineer can follow the BEM Circular Number 008 procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice for proper procedures to take over the project from the first engineer. A. I am the first engineer of Project A. During tender, the contractor proposed an alternative design which is designed by another ECP or PEPC, second engineer, engaged by the contractor. I, as the first engineer after due engineering considerations, rejected the alternative design. Can the client, upon awarding the project to the contractor, allow the alternative design to be adopted and replace me with the second engineer, which is the ECP or PEPC engaged by the contractor? B. Has the second engineer proposing the alternative design for the contractor during tendering for the project violated Regulation 31 of the Registration of Engineers Regulations 1990, revised 2015, by directly or indirectly supplant or attempt to supplant or intervene another registered engineer or ECP? A. The alternative design proposed by the contractor is not acceptable to you does not mean that the 2ND engineer can just take over your project. The second engineer cannot take over from the first engineer unless he obtained the letter of release from the first engineer or he can follow the procedures stated in BEM Circular Number 008 procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice. B. As the second engineer was engaged by the contractor to assist in the tendering and to propose an alternative design to help the contractor bid for the project, he has not violated Regulation 31. However, he has to comply to item A above if the contractor is successful. My ECP has been asked by the contractor to carry out design for the design and build tender with the understanding that upon successfully securing the project, my ECP will be employed to complete the design, endorsement and supervision of the project. Upon successfully securing the project, The contractor decided not to engage my ECP due to reasons that the client has asked him to use other ECP or for some other reasons. Does the other ECP need to get a letter of release from me? An ECP can only lay claim to be the first engineer provided that the ECP has been appointed, which can mean a contract or agreement in writing between the ECP in which it is practicing and the party that engages them, in this case the contractor. BEM considers that there is a contract or agreement in writing if the contract or agreement is made in writing whether or not it is signed, or if the contract or agreement is made by exchange of communication in writing, e.g. letters, emails, or fax. If the ECP is the first engineer, then the second engineer cannot take over from the first engineer unless he obtains a letter of release from the first engineer, or he can follow the procedures stated in BEM Circular Number 008 procedure for a registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice taking over the work of another registered engineer or an engineering consultancy practice.
If you like our content, kindly like, share and subscribe.